Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Institute and this latest event hosted by MEI Syria program, entitled The Troubling Reality Behind the United Nations Procurement Contracts in Syria. Although it may have fallen away from the headlines somewhat, Syria's crisis does persist over 11 years on. Though open conflict may have reduced in scale in recent years, it continues in every corner of the country. And in 2022, levels of humanitarian suffering across Syria have never been higher. 97% of Syrians inside the country live under the poverty line today. More than 50% of the in-country population are displaced. Assad controls approximately 65% of the country, but he rules less than half of the population. 4 years ago, global headlines covered inflation affecting the Syrian pound when it was roughly 1,800 Syrian pounds to the US dollar. 4 years later, today, it is over 5,000. After 2.5 years of the COVID pandemic, Syria is now being hit by cholera. So amidst this unprecedented humanitarian crisis, the United Nations sits at the very heart and plays the central role in attempting at least to ameliorate those humanitarian conditions. And it does this in two ways: through the cross-border aid mission via Turkey, which potentially is under threat again in a vote in the Security Council this coming January. And it does primarily through, secondarily, the Damascus mission in the capital of Syria, which is intended to provide for all in a scale of billions of dollars every year. But in reality, the reality is far more complicated. The brutal, all-controlling, all-seeing and corrupt nature of the regime has constrained aid actors' ability to accomplish their neutral serve-all mission. Year after year, as we've seen since 2011, UN-directed aid has been diverted and impeded in a systematic fashion. But beyond impeding, the regime appears also to have corrupted, to an extent, the behavior of some of these aid actors. The inefficiencies, the corruption and the abuses within the UN system in Damascus has been known about for years through anecdotes, individual incidents that have been reported through the media, but rarely with the kind of concrete data and systematic, system-wide analysis and details that you're going to hear about today. In 2021, in fact, two of the people on this stage, Natasha and Karan, reported on how the Syrian regime was forcing the United Nations and international NGOs to use distorted exchange rates to bring aid funds into Syria, whereby 51% of every single dollar was effectively being stolen by Syria's central bank. Last week, the Associated Press reported on the deeply rooted corruption at the highest levels of the World Health Organization's operation in Damascus. Corruption, misuse of funds, currying favors and paying and providing projects to regime actors themselves. And now today, as we gather here today, we have a new and completely unprecedented, in my opinion, report by the Syrian Legal Development Program, SLDP, and the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks, which reveals in plain terms, and as I say, based on concrete data, I think the shocking reality of the United Nations procurement operation in Syria. As the report's two authors will shortly reveal in detail, nearly 50% of all procurement operations in Syria in 2019 and 20 went directly to Syrian suppliers that posed a very high or a high risk of association with regime crimes and human rights abuses. And beyond that, nearly a quarter of all UN procurement funding in Syria was sourced through entities that are already sanctioned by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union for their role in human rights violations and war crimes. So given the enormous scale of the UN's operation in Damascus, these findings should serve as an unprecedented wake-up call at the UN and within donor states who are providing billions of dollars every year for UN aid operations in Syria. So naturally, as the director of MEI Syria program, I am honored to be hosting this important event and thrilled to welcome our four panelists on the stage today. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out all their bios, but we do have Karam Shah, the co-author of today's released report, who is the Syrian program manager at the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks, and an affiliated scholar here at the Middle East Institute. We have Iyad Hamid on the end, a senior researcher at the Syrian Legal Development Program and also the co-author of this important report. Then we have Natasha Hall, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. And finally, we have Sarah Kayali, who's currently at Columbia Law School, but until quite recently was a senior Syria researcher at Human Rights Watch, within which I think this whole issue was a kind of constant theme of her attention. So to begin today's event, Karam and Iyad will present some opening remarks on their report, which is entitled UN Procurement Contracts in Syria, a Few Bad Apples, ? And I think we'll see them address that question mark throughout today's event. The report was just released roughly an hour ago, so you should be able to find it online. This opening briefing will be both verbal and visual, as Karam and Iyad guide us through their research and the extraordinary amount of data that has fed into their work. And after that, we will hear from Natasha and Sarah with some initial responses to what we will have heard from Karam and Iyad, followed by a moderated conversation, and then hopefully plenty of time for Q&A with our audience here in person and online. So for those of you online, I would encourage you to pose your questions on Zoom. And for those of you on the live stream on YouTube, by emailing events@mei.edu. So without further ado, after that long introduction, let me hand over, I think, first to Iyad and then Karam.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I'm very grateful to be hosted here at the Middle East Institute. At the SLDP, we work on the issues of business and human rights in Syria. And back in January earlier this year, we worked with Human Rights Watch. Sarah was working on that guide as well. We produced a guide on human rights compliant procurement processes in Syria. In the advocacy calls that followed with the relevant stakeholders, we were asked the question, are these examples you're providing in the report individual cases, a few bad apples, or is it something that is more prevalent? Are these suppliers more problematic than that? And that's where the idea came from. Now, I have to give a disclaimer from early on. Following the guide, we engaged with the UN and we had response from the UN country team. And since then, they have been very engaging with us. So it's not just an issue of accusation. We're really trying to reform the work and get to a positive outcome. What we thought of at SLDP that, you know, as you mentioned, Karam is one of the guys who have been working on this issue. So we joined efforts. We decided to investigate the top 100 suppliers in the last 2 available years in the procurement database the UN offers. At the time, it was 2019 and 2020. And we decided to investigate their backgrounds and provide hold some interviews with relevant actors as well to supplement the knowledge we have with former UN procurement officers, Syria specialists, and some businessmen who engaged in the tender process in Syria. Just a few notes on the on how we managed to quantify the results that we have. So the guide that was published in January includes a risk assessment tool that includes risk indicators based on our analysis of the Syrian business scene and procurement practices. And again, Sarah knows very much about it, that she worked on the project too. We created 4 levels of risk, and risk being the likelihood of being involved in human rights abuses in that sense, very high to low. And the interviews we held kind of adjusted the indicators a little bit also to accommodate the new information we got from that, which we'll explain at some point later. Karam will be explaining the investigations and their methodology, and then I'll pick up from that.
Thank you very much. So basically, I mean, I just want to say, or maybe tell you how this work is different from previous work. And I don't want to discredit previous work. Some amazing work has been done before on this topic. I mean, Natasha's work here is pretty impressive with the number of interviews she managed to work on, and with multiple stakeholders. So, and there's recently, for example, the Associated Press investigation revealing what's happening at the highest levels in the World Health Organization. They showed that Well, basically the WHO is donating golden coins and cars to regime officials, which is very disturbing. But how is this work different from previous work? I think there are three main differences. We took one database from the UN, which is Procurement's database. Now, this basically constitutes less than 10% of donor funding, humanitarian donor funding to Syria. But the good thing is we actually covered over 90% of suppliers in that database, which are private sector suppliers. And therefore, we can actually make generalizations about the procurement process. Now, are these generalizations applicable to everything happening at the UN? Not necessarily, but at least we can talk about one area in concrete terms. We looked at basically everyone in there. So that's the main difference. The second is we relied on open source information. So we at the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks have been building a proprietary database, but that database actually relies overwhelmingly on open source intelligence. So what we've shown in this report is with open source intelligence, you can actually prove so many things. You can do advanced due diligence. Now, obviously open source is not enough for you to do due diligence, but imagine with those resources, yet we managed to actually highlight all of this. And the last thing is, even though this is open source, that does not mean it comes from Facebook statuses. It's actually primarily based on the Syrian Gazette. So we looked at the incorporation documents of these companies that are being contracted by the UN. So much of the evidence, I'd say maybe all of it, is irrefutable. We have the evidence backing it. So what did we find in this work? A good way to present the findings is to use this interactive element. Is that better? All right, that seems to work. So can everyone see my screen? Yeah. Yeah. So here you're basically looking at the top 100 suppliers that we investigated in this report. So at the center, you see UN agencies. And here in these circles, you see the suppliers to those UN agencies. Now, a couple of things before I tell you a little bit more about the findings. The colors in here signify the risk level. So, for example, anything in red here is very high risk. And here we relied on the SLDP Human Rights Watch guide. And the second thing I want to note is the size of these circles also tells you the amount of funding received by this agency. So big circles have received a lot more funding than small circles. So basically, with this in mind, I can tell you a few things. So we classified the findings into a group of 7 main findings. I'll tell you about 4 of them, and then my colleague Iyad can tell you about the other 3. So the first and most disturbing one is actually human rights abusers receiving UN funding. We identified quite a few examples, but the connection is lost. So I'll disconnect from yours and just connect on mine. All right, you should be able to see my screen again.
No, because it's through the Wi-Fi.
I'll share again.
Scan there.
All right. Okay. So the first finding is human rights abusers receiving funding through the United Nations. And one of the most shocking ones is actually this one, this company called Saqr al-Sahra. Saqr al-Sahra has actually received over $1 million from UNICEF and UNRWA. And it's co-owned by 2 very problematic owners. One of them is Fadi Saqr, who is the head of the National Defense Forces in Damascus, considered to be the mastermind behind the Tadamun massacre in Damascus, one of the most notorious massacres in the country. The other co-owner, Bilal al-Na'al, is also a regime crony. He's currently a member of parliament as well, and he's also a partner with many other human rights abusers who are also sanctioned. Bilal al-Na'al is sanctioned by the United States, by the way. So, Fadi Saqr is sanctioned by the United States, by the way. The second thing is sanctioned individuals receiving funding from the United Nations. So there we basically calculated that 23% of procurement funding over the 2 years we looked at, 2019 and 2020, is actually going to companies fully owned or at least co-owned by sanctioned individuals, be it by the EU, UK, or the United States. We didn't look at other sanctions there. And the list of names there is quite long. So for example, earlier work has identified Samir Foz, for example, and Mohammed Hamsho, but we found a lot more than those. So Rania Dabbas, for instance, or Samir Hassan, and so on. The third point, which is very, very important, and we actually realized how important this point is after the WHO investigation a couple of days ago, which relates to UN transparency. So it's one thing for us to go and search where there is data, where the light is switched on, and a whole other thing for us to try to find out what's happening where the light is completely off. So quite often, the UN basically refused to tell us who they're contracting with. And in this database, we made a very simple calculation. What share of procurement is going to suppliers whose identity is suppressed either for security or privacy reasons? And we wanted to know if this share is high specifically in Syria, whether this is peculiar to Syria. So we compared it with the top 5 recipients of UN funding, and actually found that suppressions in Syria are at least twice as high as in any other recipient country. Now, what did we realize from the WHO? The WHO, where there are so many issues, they actually have the highest share of suppressions in the database. So virtually everyone in that database has their identities suppressed. And the UN reiterate that there's nothing to worry about there. These suppressions are indeed for privacy reasons. Well, you need to understand that there is a conflict there and so on, only for us to realize that some golden coins and cars are being handed out to regime officials. The last point I want to make is the reliance on large contracts. So it's actually easy for you here to see that if you look at this map, the 100 suppliers that we investigated, look at the high risk, or maybe actually look at the very high risk suppliers, look at the size of these circles and compare them with low risk suppliers. So actually, quite often, problematic ones are the ones who tend to have bigger contracts as well. And my colleague Iyad here will clarify this a little bit more. I promise the very last point is we're not anti-UN. We're not trying to attack the UN. There are so many people there doing a great job. However, there are serious issues that need to be addressed. In fact, we worked with them. We sent them the report, improved the recommendations based on what they told us. They opened our eyes to a few issues that we were not aware of. They're the ones operating on the ground. We're just trying to make things better.
Yeah. Thank you, Karam. Karam has identified 4 of the issues that we mentioned in the report. The remaining 3 are primarily based on the interviews we held. The major one is the issue with fronts and intermediaries. Now, because some names have become so exposed, they rely on other players on the ground to work on their behalf. This is a tactic that's used in money laundering and sanctions evasion. But we noticed that some suppliers are also doing that in Syria. Now, one of the largest suppliers whose identity was completely unknown prior to 2011, his name is Rami Qabalan. We found it very problematic that someone of his background managed to get millions of dollars of contracts with the UN. Now, if you know the Syrian business scene, you would know that you cannot be that big without being linked to something problematic. The interviews, two of them were held with former employees at one of his companies, and they confirmed that he is at least a partner of Ihab Makhlouf. He is, who is the brother of Rami Makhlouf, and emerged as some sort of a compromise after Rami fell out of favor with his cousin Bashar al-Assad in 2019. There were two other issues that are not necessarily investigations related. One of them is the issue of corruption. I mean, much has been talked about it. The WHO debacle 2 days ago. It's very straightforward. Case in point, corruption in Syria is not something that emerged after 2011. It's actually a systematic way the regime uses to co-opt whatever processes there is. It's a way to run the country, and accommodating that corruption is one of the main issues that stand as a problem in the way of doing proper procurement processes. And the last one, which is also highlighted in the WHO report as well, it's the issue of protecting staff. In order for staff to do, the UN staff, local staff, in order for them to do the work in a way that leads to proper results, they have to feel secure. They cannot be exposed and threatened by either their bosses or the intelligence agencies or whatever it is. They can't work under such conditions. Now, just to summarize what Karam has been saying, few numbers. After the results of the investigations, we tried to see the categories of very high risk and high risk. And we figured out that there is 27 suppliers who fall in these two categories, while 44 in the medium level, and that's probably because we could not identify any information on them, and we decided that that should be a medium level risk because they could be or not problematic in that sense. But when it comes to the value of the contracts, and as Karam has also highlighted, the very high and high risk suppliers constitute about 47% of the sample of study, which is also a symptom of relying on large contracts where, given the business background to the country and how kleptocratic it is, it's understandable that these large contracts and this much money goes to the big monopolies. After doing all of this, we thought, we should do something more positive and provide recommendations to donor states and UN agencies to improve the processes. And Karam will be speaking about the donor states recommendations, and I'll pick up the UN recommendations.
I know we said 7 minutes, but I think we took a bit more than that. So I'll try to be very, very brief. So we're basically telling donor states, the first recommendation is, better what's happening there. So the first recommendation is take all the required steps to fix this. There are some stuff that you're more informed about. So however they interpret this recommendation. Now, there are more detailed ones. So we say, we appreciate that the UN's main argument is we do not abide by unilateral sanctions because these are not UN sanctions. We're telling donor states, well, on the other hand, you should tell them this is my money and I decide how you should spend it. So you can't actually use my money for funding people that I deem to be human rights abusers. When it comes to unearmarked funding, there is a serious issue with transparency, and there should either be enhanced transparency on the side of the UN, so we should know what's happening with those pooled funds and so on, or donor states should try to focus more on unearmarked funding, so they know what the initiative exactly is and they go and fund it. And the last one, or the last important one, is make additional funds available for doing this due diligence work. But I also want to highlight that we were able to do all of this on a shoestring budget. It wasn't that difficult to do much of the work from open source information.
Yeah. And when it comes to the end, we have a long list of recommendations. I'm going to keep it brief. And they are also repeated from the guide that we issued back in January with Human Rights Watch. First and foremost, the UN agencies have to incorporate human rights due diligence and their processes, not just the last phase of procurement, but the whole process. They should also, as Karam said, consult the different Western sanctions available, especially in the absence of human rights due diligence processes. There's some work that's been done there. They have proven that some suppliers are problematic. That's a tip for them to carry on from that. We are aware that they are not legally obliged to abide by it, but it's something to help while they are doing their work. There is something called the regional dialogue mechanism. It's a mechanism that takes place in Beirut, holds some of the donor states and some of the UN agencies, and that's a forum that they can ask for feedback or help or utilize to the maximum, so they can improve the processes of procurement they have. Some other things that are related to, say, dealing with the large contracts. If you have such a large contract and you can break it into smaller ones, do that and support smaller and medium-sized businesses, which are actually struggling in the country right now, and avoid working with the big sharks in the economy. And finally, it is the issue of staff. Staff need to be protected, and if that means moving some of them outside the country, that should be done. Thank you.
Great, Karami, thank you. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. It's certainly given me a million questions, but before I come to questions, let me first turn, maybe to Natasha and then Sarah for your responses. I'm not necessarily going to direct a specific question to you at this point, because I'm sure you've got plenty to say in reply, but you've both worked on this issue for a long while in your own ways, and perhaps with slightly different sort of underpinning objectives. So I would be very interested in how you both respond. So why don't we start with you, Natasha, and what you think of the report, and where do we go from here?
Right. Thank you, Charles. And thanks to MEI as well. And thanks to you both for a really, really excellent report. Nothing negative to say about it, to be honest. I think it's incredibly thorough given the limited resources that you had and the limited information that you had, given that they didn't mention, but it's about 20% of these contracts are suppressed for privacy or security reasons. And the level of abuse is incredible, or it's highly credible if you understand the context in Syria. And from my background, I focus on civilian protection, on human security. And the reality in Syria is that the consequences for reporting abuse are fatal for Syrians in many cases, and they are career-threatening for internationals. And that logically means that our visibility on corruption and abuse is going to be low. And the benefits of speaking out have been extremely limited, because we've seen many reports. We saw a 2016 OCHA report that was public. We saw a 2014 internal UN report that also spoke about this, whistleblowers, the UN WHO AP report from just last week. None of this has actually led to any kind of systematic reform. And that's kind of what's gotten us to this point, right? The least transparent response in the world, at least in terms of procurement, according to this report. And I think that should give us all pause on what else we don't have visibility on. This year, I spoke with a protection cluster lead about the response, and I asked him about reports that I was hearing about widespread sexual abuse and exploitation in part of government-controlled Syria by Syrian Arab Red Crescent employees. And I asked if he knew anything about it. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "How would I know?" And it wasn't because he didn't care about it, but he essentially said, who would those victims feel safe enough telling in the system that we currently have? They told me the regime hands over a list of potential implementers for protection activities. Think about that. I don't think you need to be an expert on Syria or an expert on humanitarian aid for that to give you pause, and maybe even to make your stomach turn. You just need to have picked up a newspaper in the past 12 years, right? So does that mean you do nothing in terms of humanitarian aid? Of course not. And neither does this report say that either, because in every humanitarian context, Humanitarian actors have to deal with nasty individuals. Oftentimes it's the reason that they're there, but you need to protect them and give them the leverage that they need to be able to negotiate and push back with those nasty actors. And I think understanding the context that I just laid out, and that has been laid out in this report as well as others, helps you build a policy that acknowledges those realities and develop safeguards. And I think failing to construct those guardrails is leading to direct contravention, in my opinion, not just of human rights abuses, but of do no harm principles and of humanitarian principles. Because you're exposing people to harm and you're emboldening those that might do them harm. And there's at least 3 reports, another one just this morning, just this week, giving evidence that both of those things are happening in Syria. And I think that the consequences, to be honest, go well beyond Syria as well. I think that the credibility and the sanctity of the international aid system is on the line at this point. And that is very unfortunate because we really need the international aid system at this time. We're facing the effects of climate change. We're facing widespread conflict between countries and within societies and less hope of conflict resolution. So we need to get this right, or at least we need to get it better. And if nothing happens, I can guarantee you that other regimes are learning from what has been done in Syria, and they're learning from the Assad playbook. And I think that this report provides some good recommendations. I just want to distill it down if I have a couple minutes or a minute. I really think that given the context that I just mentioned in Syria, we do need to work with the UN and NGOs on this, but also given the environment within Syria, we have to understand that some of this needs to be impartial analysis from outside of that system. And I think donors should collectively support, collectively is a word I'm going to use more than once here, impartial analysis on aid in Syria. And to make that analysis more effective and comprehensive, including this report, they should use their role as donors to request greater transparency from the UN. I saw the UN response to this report. One of the responses was that within the past 2 years, things have gotten better because this report related to 2019 and 2020. Well, I've just been given some numbers from 2021. And First Class, which is one of the companies that's been mentioned in the report, Desert Falcon, another one mentioned in the report, Rami Kabbalan Trading Establishment, another organization mentioned in the report of high-risk actors, have been given over $6 million in 2021. So something is still not changing. And I would also say that donors need to meet amongst themselves and coordinate their response with the UN and develop recommendations for the UN before the regional dialogue mechanism meetings that they have, which I think are really valuable if you have consistent, comprehensive information to feed into it. And then work with the UN and aid workers on the challenges that they face, because there are significant challenges. Dealing with the Syrian regime isn't easy, as we have seen. And then I think for the United States, I would just say one more thing. I think, taking a cue from the US's own strategy on countering corruption could be useful here. The White House has said it's a core national security interest, and the strategy specifically mentions supporting civil society in this effort. And in Syria, I think donors could support civil society to feed into social accountability in a more systemic, secure, and safe way to get a better handle on egregious instances of abuse throughout the country. And as Karam mentioned, I think these recommendations would require resources, because you can't just tell overworked government employees and aid workers to have more meetings or do more work. That's not going to work, right? But then again, these resources will probably pay for themselves. We've already seen that in this report and in other reports. And I think even more importantly, and I'll end it here, you need to have the collective will to do something about what comes out of these analyses. And that's what we haven't really seen yet. And I really hope that this report and others that we've seen this week really prompts a little bit of introspection and then collective will moving forward. But I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's hope. Thanks, Natasha.
Yeah.
Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the report. I have to say, when I read it, it was it was an absolute pleasure reading it, not because of anything, right? Because the information in it is quite negative, but because, as kind of you said, it really quantifies the problem in a way that's extremely concrete and in a way that responds to a lot of the sort of UN and donor objections to previous reports, in the sense of like, can you give us more examples? And I think, but sort of more importantly than the examples that you had provided is this indication that it's systemic, right? Like the Human Rights Watch SLDP report from January showcased like the policies of the procurement processes. We looked deeply at the policies, legal analysis, and provided very concrete recommendations. But what we didn't have was the evidence to show that it was systemic. It wasn't just a few bad apples. And I think that's sort of the contribution of the report on this level is extremely important. But I wanted to sort of take a step back and sort of emphasize this idea of how do you solve for this, right? We've been talking about these issues since 2014. We've had a number of what you call the gotcha reports, right? Like scandalous exposés of things that are happening similar to what has happened with the AP and WHO. Donors know, right? Like donors know what is going on in Syria, right? They know how difficult it is to do humanitarian aid operations. They know that UN staff get their visa revoked. They know that a lot of these contracts are going to human rights abusers, right? They know this. They don't know how many because of the transparency issues, right? But they know. Then the question is, what are they going to do about it? And I think this is where we are today is at this question. A number of human rights organizations, Syrian civil society organizations have reports with pages and pages of extremely concrete recommendations. But we haven't seen these recommendations really manifest at the scale that is required to stem the abuse and corruption that we see in Syria, right? And it's a very difficult operating environment for humanitarians, but there are recommendations out there that are implementable. There are parts that I disagree with in sort of the sense that it's not hard, right? It's a difficult operating environment, but it's not hard because of the amount of resources that are going to the aid operations. And I think the answer to that, sort of echo you, Natasha, and sort of, I think this was in your report and in other reports, is the collective bargaining issue, right? Donors have to come together and collectively bargain vis-a-vis the Syrian government for these kinds of protections, for these recommendations to be implemented. They're not bargaining vis-a-vis UN agencies where you're sort of dictating to UN agencies what they need to do, and then the UN agency is like, but I need to deliver these food baskets. The UN agency actually shouldn't, it's a secondary target, right? What the donors need to come together and provide a collective front vis-a-vis the Syrian government and take on the difficulty of negotiating that the UN agencies face vis-a-vis the Syrian government. Because the UN agencies are like, I want access. I want my staff to be able to operate. I want to be able to, help people out. And then what's the response to that? The response to that is donors have to step in and sort of support UN agencies in being able to do that mission, but do it in a way that aligns with human rights principles, do it in a way that doesn't do harm on the ground. And I think that sort of the emphasis on this idea of doing things collectively is very important. The other factor that sort of comes to me as from the research that I've done, but also from what you've said, is that we have issues within sort of the UN with the lack of transparency and due diligence, and it's not a resource issue, right? Like there are resources that have been earmarked for this kind of work, for doing due diligence, for the human rights advisor to exist and sort of provide guidance on this. The question is whether there is political will, both internally and externally, to be able to implement this. And I think on that, the involvement of UN headquarters in New York, the agencies, Damascus shouldn't be doing this. The Damascus country team shouldn't be doing this on their own, right? They can engage us to the extent possible, but their principles actually misalign with what we're saying, because they're more operationally focused. But UN headquarters actually has a big role to play. And that was basically it. I think the report is excellent. The recommendations are incredible. And I look forward to this changing.
Inshallah. Let me ask a question. I'm going to be sort of, I don't know if devil's advocate is the right phrase here, but I'm going to go more pessimistic in the hope that you can give me and the audience more grounds for optimism. I, like all of you, I'm sure, have sat in many conversations with folks from the UN, from donor governments, and analysts and experts who have all heard many of these incidents, allegations about whether it's systemic or not, about the system and the problems. And on many other issues, in fact, the excuse is often, you know, there's a reason Bashar and his father Hafez have been in power for 50 years, and it's because they've created a system that is all-seeing, all-controlling, impenetrable. There's a reason Bashar survived 11 years on. You know, is this very troubling reality an inescapable reality? Is this just something that you have to grit your teeth and accept? That's what I've heard. It's not my opinion. I should say, and I think my opening comments probably make that pretty clear. But that is very often the argument put forward, that yes, we really dislike this, but there is no other way. I think, you know, there's been conversations in the past about if Syria is to move forward with the regime in place, is there a way for the international community to support, quote unquote, sort of independent civil society to operate and to improve conditions locally without being interfered by the regime? And then you have this comeback. Well, yes, maybe for a sort of seed period, but eventually they'll be co-opted and intimidated. So again, we have this situation where the regime has kind of corrupted the system and forced people, the vast majority of whom would like to be doing an absolutely perfect job, but can't, to be in this state of affairs that we've described. So what is the real alternative? In sort of plain language, is it possible to do a lot better than this? We all know due diligence work can be done. We all know, everyone knows that many of these actors are bad actors. But in kind of concrete, simple terms, this is a question to really all of you, or any of you that want to answer it. What really is the sort of best case scenario if the UN takes this seriously, if donor governments come to the table and put ultimatums down? You know, what's the kind of best case that we can sort of hope for, and how do we get there? So maybe why don't we start with Iyad and Karam first, and then Natasha and Sarah.
Yeah, and I do have a thing or two to say on this. Now, the thing is, one of the things that came in the report is challenging how well the processes that the UN says that it's obliged to do, how well they're doing these things. So, for example, the case of Fadi Saqr, when we asked about the vetting process that they do for the suppliers, they were like, we check the legal ownership of a company, which is usually a document showing the legal owners of that company. Fadi Malik Ahmed, aka Fadi Saqr, is listed as one of the owners of that company. It was a very easy thing to just Google that person's name, 2 seconds. The first result you get is a page, his profile on the Ba'ath Party, telling you that he is he was a head of the National Defense Militia, and you know, like it took us literally 2 minutes to find that out. You just go to the official gazette, you figure it out, then you look up the name, you find it. Now that means one step to do that is actually, you know, at least do the things that you're saying that you're committed to doing, and that will improve the quality of your work way beyond that. I'm not going to talk beyond the procurement process, because the questions you ask are very difficult. It's a very difficult pill to swallow right now to say, well, Assad regime is staying, and we have to work with them, and whatever money they will pocket, we have to be okay with it because this is the humanitarian situation in the country. I'm sure there are things that have to be done. We can help in brainstorming and finding solutions to that, but as my colleagues have explained, it's the donor states and it's the UN who have to come up with strategies to fix their work so we don't fall in this problem again.
So I would say the situation currently is so bad. In fact, that bad. It's so easy to improve it with very little. And I have actually a few thoughts here. So first, I think the approach needs to be multifaceted. So we can't just work with the UN or just work with donor states or just civil society. Everyone has a role to play and a genuine role to play. We don't have to go and talk to the UN because we have to, because it looks nice that, yeah, we're working with them. They can contribute to this debate. Donor states, they need to put the pressure. They have the strength. And we should be also able to speak everyone's language. So if you want to talk to donor states, for example, it's all well and good to talk to them behind closed doors. However, you have to also work with the media. You have to create some heat for them to act. And obviously, you should always get the balance right. When you talk to the UN, you need to appreciate that there are so many people in the UN trying to do a lot better. And in fact, that report from the Associated Press is approved. How did we find that out? From UN staff. They themselves actually told us that. So, and civil society, I believe, has a huge role to play. So the UN is not going to change its behavior markedly, partly because they are under regulatory constraints. Some of the constraints they're under relate to the regime. Some of them are because of bad practices, but some of them are just regulatory. It's a club of UN countries. They have to work with the Syrian regime. And so I think civil society can help a lot by assessing all the work the UN is doing. And this takes me to the second point. I don't think we should make this as a one-off effort. We don't just publish a report and move on. This has to be continuous. We have to have resources and sit and assess the work they're doing post-implementation. It would be ideal if we could do it ex ante, but that's not possible. Therefore, I think we should, instead of just focusing on procurements, we should pick every single database the UN has and do this every year, every time there is a piece of information released. This is a collective effort, as Sarah put it perfectly. We have to tackle it from multiple angles.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha.
Yeah, I mean, I'm immediately thinking of a story of a former SARC employee where he would come to work and, every week he would see that white Peugeot 504 sitting right outside of his office. And it's a typical Syrian regime car that was there to sort of collect activities and reports on people. So I think Syrians are well aware that they're being monitored and surveilled. When I was working with Iraqi refugees in Damascus in 2010, I was being followed, and even UNHCR questioned, how I hadn't gotten kicked out of the country yet. So we have to understand those circumstances that people are under. My report earlier this year, just to follow on Karam's point, I interviewed, 130, 150 people. A third of those people were UN officials, and some of them very high-ranking UN officials. And they are very disturbed by this, and they want it to change because they want their work to be good work, right? They want to help people in need. That's why they took on this job. So I think we need to help them to do that. And so I would answer that question twofold. One, for other crises, I think that we really need to game out what happened in the early years of the response, what compromises were made, who made those compromises, why they were made, in order to have lessons that are actually learned for the next crisis. Because I've spoken to UN officials that have moved on to other crises like Ethiopia and Yemen, and they're seeing the same tactics with the Ethiopian government and with the Houthis. So I think we really need to understand that, I think, a little bit better. And then, the other recommendations, it's not going to be great. It's not going to be perfect, and it never is. But I think this due diligence that we're talking about is very doable. And the collective will to have the better bargaining position is also very doable.
Brilliant. Thanks, Natasha. Sarah?
Yeah, just very briefly, it's actually funny because when we started to do when I was at Human Rights Watch and we started to look at humanitarian operations, like human rights principles and humanitarian operations, the rationale for that was the situation on the ground in Syria is so bad. We have no leverage, right? None of us have any leverage to change the situation on the ground vis-a-vis the Syrian government. The only people who have it, the only entities with a little bit of leverage to actively and principally improve the situation are UN agencies and humanitarian organizations and their donors. That was the rationale, right? Like that was the mapping. Like here you have these international actors with access, with a very robust set of human rights principles that they need to follow, right? This is our way into improving the situation on the ground for people, to breaking the context of corruption, of surveillance, of lack of protection. It's funny because here we are, right? It was actually extremely difficult to be able to answer some of these recommendations, including ones as simple as what Iyad mentioned, right? Like there are things that they are obliged to do in their policies that they're not doing. So I think, how can I say this? Like there are two answers to this question. The first is that I think the rationale applies, right? The rationale for sort of the initial entry point applies in the sense that we are still in a place where these organizations and these entities and their donors still have the most leverage from that direction. But I think the sort of, how can I say this? The obstacle to that is actually from within these systems themselves. And I have to say, this is a bit of a sort of, it's an abstract theoretical point. What's happening in Syria is going to be happening everywhere else. We're going to see it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Yemen, we're seeing it in a number of countries where there are intractable human rights crises. But like this idea of making life better for the people on the ground is a principle, right? It's a principle and it's a framework, and that needs to be prioritized in the UN's dealings with these abusive entities beyond the Syrian conflict. Even if you can't compromise on these kinds of values. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, and that's where the improvement should be.
Yeah, I think those are brilliant questions. Totally, certainly from my side, agree with everything that's been said. And I think the direction that we're headed here is the crux of the problem lies within the UN and how it works, but also so does the solution. So let me ask I was going to say before I come to questions, but actually an online question has asked this. So let me ask Karam and Iyad, I guess, first. So this report obviously went public today, but it's been distributed to within the UN and other interested actors, before today. How has it been received? What's your gut tell you about the impact it may or may not have? Have you been in contact with donor governments? Are they, has their interest been more piqued this time than from some of the other more kind of perhaps anecdotal reporting that we've seen over the last 10 or 11 years? Give me some more grounds for optimism, please.
Okay. There is a ground for optimism. I can say that confidently. Previous reports were received by the UN in a way that was very defensive and rejectionist. We don't want that. That's not accurate and all of that. Especially after the guide, and I cannot deny that this has been a result of the previous reports and the pressure that the UN has been receiving. They decided to get and to engage with our effort at SLDP, and because of that, we decided, okay, if we're going to do this report right, we're going to have to do it in cooperation with the UN. We engaged with the UN country team, and we engaged with the UNDP, and we had a cooperative attitude, still defensive at certain fronts, but it was cooperative with promise of change. The UNDP, actually, we had a briefing with them in New York before we got here, and they explained some of the things that they have been doing, and it seems to be promising. Results yet to be seen, but there is that attitude there. When it comes to donors, there was a shock. We realized that there is a gap in communication between donor states and the UN agencies. This could be bridged by better engagement from donor states with the UN agencies. But when it comes to specifically to our report, they were very interested in the results and the recommendations because we tried to make them as practicable and as measurable as possible. And we received positive feedback and encouragement to keep in touch with them in order to help the process go ahead. I'll leave it to Karam to say other stuff on that too.
I mean, I would totally agree. In fact, to be honest, I'm really shocked that we've made it today and the report hasn't been leaked. I was like telling myself it will happen. And because we shared it actually with so many UN agencies, and the UN country team collated the feedback from multiple agencies, and some of the feedback was really, really useful. And the same applies to donor states. I think there is a will to improve things on all sides, but we need to keep the heat on, and we need to continue to work with everyone and also set our expectations right. So as Natasha said, I don't think there will ever be a day where risk is zero. That's just not possible. Our job is to lower it. And especially because, so some of the arguments you hear at times is just, seriously, that's not the right time to talk about it. People are so vulnerable. You might scare donors, and their knee-jerk reaction would be to withhold funding to the UN. I mean, I think because the situation is so horrible, now is the right time. Now we can't afford for one additional dollar to be not to arrive to the right beneficiaries. And we kept reminding donor states, please, the last thing you want to do is to withdraw funding. That is not what we're asking for. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Graham. Let me turn first to our in-person audience. I've got several questions already from online, which I'll make sure to feed in. But please, Basma.
Hi, thank you all so much. This was a really, really valuable and important conversation, and I'm really excited to read the report. Two quick questions. On your points around collective bargaining, I was wondering if any of you have engaged with humanitarian actors to look at successful examples of where this collective bargaining has happened and how we can potentially replicate that in Syria. And the other kind of quick point is maybe more of a point, less of a question, is around the framing. One of you, I think, mentioned speaking the same language. And I think that's really key, because oftentimes humanitarians are kind of they feel like they're put on the defense. And I think something to your point, Saad, that I think is worth exploring, but also kind of, there's probably going to be some pushback on that, is the framing of, the humanitarians are the ones on the ground. They're the ones that have access, and therefore they're the ones that have leverage to alleviate the human rights situation, right? And I think that's something where, as a humanitarian, I'm often on the receiving end. And I think looking at humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality, there's not a contradiction, absolutely not. I think they go hand in hand and should complement, but I think that's where that framing is where you might have humanitarians be on the defense, because we are seeing, not only in Syria, but in contexts around the world, where humanitarian assistance is becoming so politicized that, the cross-border resolution is a key example where we just can't get, stuff to work, when humanitarian aid is needed. So thank you.
Thanks, Basma. Floor is open. Do you want to kick
I
off
wouldn't
first?
be the right person. I think Natasha is better suited.
On collective bargaining, yeah, we have examples in Syria.
Exactly.
We have examples in the Northwest.
Syria,
In 2018, I actually disagreed with this, but donor governments completely shut off humanitarian aid for a month or two when it was found out that HTS was taking taxes from humanitarian aid convoys that were coming through. Actually, as soon as it was made apparent, HTS sort of backed off and stopped doing it, but we still stopped the aid, and it worked. And I think we should do that more. We've also done it in Northeast Syria, and NGOs have told me that they feel empowered to collectively bargain with the autonomous administration when they see active interference in their work, and it's worked, and they've backed down and been contrite about it. So yes, we have examples of it working. In terms of, I'm really glad you asked the question on human rights versus humanitarianism. I work in the humanitarian field, and so I do think that we need to use the language of humanitarian principles and do no harm a lot more. That's my personal take on it, because I agree with you. It's not fair for humanitarians to have to solve a conflict. That's not what they're there to do. And to solve human rights abuses. That's also what they're not there to do. but I think using the language of humanitarian workers like duty of care. So duty of care for your workers. So that means not having NGO workers on the front line negotiating with armed actors on their own. One, that's immoral, but two, it's really ineffective. And that goes back to the collective bargaining piece of this. And I've interviewed, and I mean, I've worked in the humanitarian system, so I've been on the back end of this, but you know, interviewed many other former colleagues about times where they've been detained and tortured because they pushed back. And you know, we need to avoid that for many, many reasons. But I think that that was a really, really great point. So thank you for making it.
Yeah, so very quickly, I maybe like understood your question a bit differently about the collective bargaining, but like I was thinking of it of more of the sort of the like what models of collaboration that we've seen that are successful and where those have, and again, like Northeast Syria is a good one, right? Like the Northeast Syria Forum, which is a forum of humanitarian operations that deals with the UN. That doesn't really, like, I mean, it exists in principle in Damascus, but it's not really functional, right? And that's a huge problem, right? Because if they had come together and shared their issues, I think the UN country team to a certain extent is trying to do this with UN agencies. They're not quite there yet, but also because the incentives are different, right? There's a competition for access, for entry point, because it's also a competition for funding, right? Like I get to 600 schools, you get to 300. So I think that mentality also has to change. And we've seen models within Syria that have been incredibly scarily successful. Also, the UN in the Northwest, and like the coordination role that the UN has there is a much more advanced one than what we've seen, at least what I've seen in the Damascus context. So I think that's sort of worth keeping in mind. On the human rights humanitarian one, you know, it's like I'm a human rights researcher by training. This is what so when we did a report at Human Rights Watch in 2019 where I came up against this in particular. So I spent a lot of time looking at humanitarian principles and how they sort of match with the human rights framework. And there's a lot there, right? There's a lot of overlap. And I think, I mean, and I can give examples, right? Like protection activities, detentions, arbitrary arrests. These are all protection activities that UNICEF and the ICRC and other agencies claim to be doing. And these are also sort of directly derived from human rights principles. But I'm going to make a more sort of overarching and abstract point that's gonna, you know, if we all take like a step back, like why do I do human rights work? Why do you do humanitarian work? The point is the same, right? The point is the same. We want to make life for these people better on the ground. And I think as I'm no longer human rights officer, so I can say this. As long as you're looking at that as your sort of ultimate aim, you can really do anything. And then one final formal point is that the UN itself includes human rights principles in its consideration, right? So they are obliged to abide by it and include it in their supplier contracts, in their disclosures, in their programmatic. So they have to do it.
I'll switch things up and ask a question from online. I'll more or less read it out. So, which is the UN agency that appears most in the data? I'm not actually sure who this comes from, but they also say, please note that most donors do not have a direct dialogue with the Syrian government. But so starting such a dialogue may be twisted by the government and framed as normalizing relationship with donor countries. So I guess that question is primarily to both of you, Iyad and Karam. So which UN agency appears most in the data, and then how do you think about whether or not dialogue with the government or opening up new dialogues with the government could be as much of a danger as a positive thing?
I'll say a couple of things and then give it back to you, Karam. Now, when it comes to the data, we took the data collectively, so we didn't do an agency on its own. But I can say on the engagement, we only got engagement from the UNDP and a collective response from the UN country team. The contract we mentioned for the Desert Falcon, that was with the UNICEF and UNRWA. And it would be great if we could speak to them and see the circumstances through which they ended up making their mind on that contract, because maybe there are things we don't know. engagement is key in this situation. Dialogue with the government. I heard it from UN agencies and humanitarian actors asking for that. I personally agree with the point that's mentioned that the regime will use that as a screen to say, look, people are just normalizing relations with me, and to a certain extent, it may not lead to any actual results. However, there could be some people argue, and I don't know where I stand on that myself. Some people argue that you can do some progress by direct engagement on local level. Local level in Syria is not as corruptible, but it's still controlled by the central government. There's more dynamics beyond my expertise, so I'm not going to speak on it. But that was one of the things that was proposed at some point in the conversations we had.
Karam?
So in terms of the size of each UN agency, you can kind of guess who they are basically from what you hear in the news. So most of the work is related to providing food and shelter. And indeed, the largest recipients are the WFP and UNHCR. Other UN agencies tend to be far smaller. But on the engagement with the Syrian regime, to me, I feel like I understand engagement does not necessarily mean normalization, but I don't see the point in doing that. So talk to the Syrian regime to do what? In fact, you are one layer further from the Syrian regime. You're not working with the regime when it comes to this kind of work. The ones implementing the work are actually UN agencies or INGOs. So your job, I believe, should be to talk to them. Am I skeptical about talking to the Syrian regime in general? Very much so. And I'm not sure I actually even agree wholeheartedly with the view that engagement does not mean normalization, especially with a regime like that of Bashar al-Assad. You will get there. Give it some time and you'll get there. And what I mean by give it some time and you'll get there is exactly like what happened with UN agencies and the regime. Initially, in the first couple of years, they were trying to push back. They were trying to resist the pressure from the regime. Now they're fully tamed. Whatever you want, that's the difficult that's a difficult environment for us to operate in, and therefore let's just do what the regime tells us. There's very, very little resistance from them now, and that's not right.
Thanks, Karam. Natasha, I'm sorry, do you have anything to add on there?
I mean, just on the second point, I mean, we have interlocutors with actors all the time. And I've been advocating for that with HTS and the Salvation Government too, that we need a better negotiations framework. Is it going to be the US government doing it? No, it's going to be somebody else, but that doesn't, negate the ability for us to do that.
Okay, any other questions in the room? Please, Mohammed.
Thank you so much for the MEI. This is a great discussion, very timely, and for the great work of the panelists. I guess I have a comment and a question. My comment is, I do think this is only scratching the surface of the UN system. I think implementation of aid in Syria. I think you guys have done a great job sort of highlighting that most of those sort of links are to people who are human rights abusers, and drastically so. But as we know, I think the Assad regime has ways that are much more sophisticated to abuse the system, even with people who are not as clearly designated as a human right, abuser. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I do believe this is only scratching the surface of what this could be from. My question is to the recommendations, again, trying to be positive here. Since I think few of us here work with the US government and try to advocate for of the US, I think role, on Syria in general, and for sure for this one, do you have any specific recommendation for the US government of why, they should be concerned about this, and what they can do for this? Again, from your very, I think, detailed expertise on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Anyone on the floor wants to take it?
I'll leave the second part for you, and I'll just comment on the comment.
All right.
Yes, This has been a scratch of the surface. I absolutely agree. The interviews, at least the one that I held, revealed way more things that are about project implementation and cooperation with government ministries and internal corruption, and they were not relevant to the content of the report itself, so they're not mentioned. But you're absolutely right. There is way more to be done, and if we are to replicate the work we've done here, we need more primary evidence and data. And if anybody has any information on that and would like us to work together on it, please, we're here.
I also completely agree on the first point, and on the recommendations to the US government. I would say we need to tell them you're the largest donor for the humanitarian response in Syria, and therefore your responsibility should be greater. And so that's the first point. The second is I don't think it should be acceptable at all to say that we can't believe what the UN is doing with our money. That's not good. It's not just the UN's responsibility, it's also the donor's responsibility. They should do their own due diligence on how that money is spent. So, for example, one of the responses we kept hearing from the UN is, look, we know these suppressions in the procurement database, the withheld names, but bear in mind, donor states actually know the identities of all of those suppliers. But you go and talk to donor states, can you tell us actually who these suppliers are? They say, we've never asked for them. So don't ask, don't tell. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done by donor states. And again, as I said earlier, we need to speak their language. So we need to show why they should be interested in this. And one way to do this is, look, if more of this goes publicly, there will be more pressure on you. It'll be you not doing a good job, basically. That's one way. The other way is to work with them and try to identify people who are more sympathetic to the cause. And obviously, as is always the case in any organization, you can find some of those people and some others who don't really care much.
Just quickly on your last point on the reasons they should care, because sometimes humanitarianism doesn't get us to that point. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work at CSIS on protracted crises, and this very narrow window that we have to make a better trajectory in conflict-affected areas, or even areas affected by natural disasters. I think we see the outcome of failing to use that window wisely into the east and to the west of Syria, right? We will be facing these challenges. We will be facing outward migration, regional instability, international instability for decades to come. And so we need to manage that. And that happens in Syria. It's also going to happen across the Sahel. It's going to happen in many other contexts. But I think that if we don't take advantage of that moment in time before the guys with the guns really control every economic sector, we're missing that opportunity, and it doesn't come back.
Yeah, just very briefly on the US government. So when we did our advocacy with them, it's USAID funds things separately from like the collective fund for the UN, and so they have their own sets of principles and parameters and policies that they follow vis-a-vis UN agencies that they're funding in Syria, and so that's true, right? It is what happens, but I think there's one of the recommendations that we've tried to engage the US government on is that there needs to be even greater scrutiny than what they have currently exists in the USAID policies, because it doesn't actually rise to what you see, I think, in the recommendations of this report or the guide. There's more to be done, and I think that's a particular point that needs to be emphasized.
Fantastic. I know there's more questions in here, but I'll turn to an online one first. So there's been a couple of questions which have basically asked how the findings of this report feed into, or how are they relevant to the kind of ongoing debate around cross-line and cross-border access. I would throw in, my 2 cents in saying that I heard a couple of months ago that the regime basically controls who provides cross-line assistance into northwestern Syria. They literally select the staff who they permit to drive the trucks to northwestern Syria, a pretty minimal number of trucks as it happens. But so I guess the answer is it's more or less the same problem, but I'm interested in all of your different takes on that.
If I can, yeah, maybe go first. So, I mean, I think this just gives us yet more evidence that we can't afford to lose cross-border aid. Do you want to give yet more money to the UN based in Damascus and have the Assad regime influencing everything happening in there? And I think if you look at donor states and the way they view the situation in Syria, you can tell why why UN operations in Northwest Syria are actually better than elsewhere. Why? Because there's this obsession with terrorism. So you want to make sure not a single penny goes to them. There's way more focus on what's happening in Northwest Syria and who's implementing that aid and whether it's reaching beneficiaries and so on, as opposed to regime-held areas. And there I see an ethical problem as well. I appreciate for Western countries, terrorism is a bigger threat than Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad kills his own people. Terrorists are willing to kill people abroad. But we should also just pause for a second and remember that over 90% of civilians in Syria were killed by that secular man. They were killed by Bashar al-Assad, not by terrorists. They're kind of competing who's more horrible, but we should put things in context. In context, Bashar al-Assad is just as horrible as these guys are, not more.
Thanks, Karim. Anyone else?
I mean, we talk a lot about decolonization of aid and localization of aid, and I think that this is a moment where you have 2/3 of the population in the Northwest that have been forcibly displaced by this regime, under siege and under bombardment by this regime. And what I've heard from, several aid officials or diplomats is that, oh, HTS is pushing back, oh, the Turkish government is pushing back on these cross-line convoys. Ask the beneficiaries. Ask the people in the Northwest whether they want cross-line aid. Ask the local aid workers that work in that area whether they want cross-line aid. Because if we're going to do localization, it should actually take their interests and their trauma into account. So that's not a very strategic point of view, but I think that that's something that we've all been talking about a lot, and the humanitarian community has been talking about a lot, and we're not following through.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Nope. Questions in the room? Let's do two, Kateva and then Chad.
Thank you so much. Very informative conversation. And, looking forward to reading the report for sure. Question related to the collective bargaining piece. I think one conversation that has been happening a lot in Western capitals, especially following the re-engagement or reviving the step-for-step process, is what would be the verification process to make sure that the regime is actually, implementing, under pressure, whether a just distribution of aid, whether the utilization of whether best utilization of, procurement suppliers. How do we ensure, especially that, looking at the numbers, for example, between procurement and reporting, we have, 18 to 24 months of time. And, a year and a half and 2 years in Western capitals is a very long time, because you might be able to implement pressure to put conditions on the ground. And then in 2 years, the mood and the political will is not there, whether in Washington, in London, or anywhere else. We've seen examples of that. I think the example a lot of people can see is the implementation of the chemical weapons agreement. Once the pressure was a little bit off the Assad regime, they went back, to storing chemical agents. So what is the best verification method to ensure that we have continuous pressure and that the regime is implementing the conditions that are best for the distribution of aid?
Great, thanks, Kateva. And Chad?
I just want to circle back a bit to what Dr. Becker brought up about the U.S. government's response. I'm looking towards the congressional side of things. My concern is that if you make this pitch, you make this argument on the report, it's a very good one, and I look forward to reading it, just as Koteba said. I think that from the Republican perspective, what you're going to hear is then, well, just cut it off. No aid, we don't want to see go into Assad's pockets. So therefore just end it. taking the Robert Ford argument in that respect. What would you like to see Congress do? Is it introducing legislation to create more transparency, or is it more a letter and outreach, making speeches saying there needs to be more transparency, the Biden administration needs to do X, Y, and Z?
Okay, so questions on verification mechanisms and how to deal with Congress. So that's always an easy one.
Really big questions.
I mean, I'm happy to answer the second one. On the verification process, I'm not taking it because it's so difficult. I really don't know, seriously. So, I mean, I know I said I'll take the second one, but on verification, how do you work with such a regime? And just remember a few examples. So when Article 8 was taken out of the Constitution, the Ba'ath Party is the leader of society. The share of Ba'ath seats in Parliament increased in following elections. When the chemical stockpile was handed out, the number of chemical attacks increased after it. When Bashar al-Assad was saying, if you control your borders with Mexico, we can control our borders with Iraq, he was effectively sending foreign fighters into Iraq to destabilize it following the invasion in March 2003. So I don't know how you work with such a regime, but luckily, I feel this is maybe an issue for the UN to address. They are on the ground. They know how to work with it. I think we need to just talk to donor states so they can get the UN to do a better job. Now, the issue is, how much can the UN do? I think there isn't much they can do. Obviously, when it comes to corruption and misconduct, there is a lot they can do. But when it comes to dealing with the Syrian regime, they're handcuffed, more or less. And so what I would be saying is, you have to work with INGOs and civil society wherever possible. Steer clear from the UN. You can't do that everywhere, but at least try. And I have done so much consulting work for INGOs in Syria, and they definitely have better standards for implementation and for due diligence and so on. On the Congress piece, I think what should be done is not peculiar to Syria. I think the US should have a mechanism for reviewing how their aid money is spent. You don't just hand money over to implementers and assume goodwill just because they're the United Nations. I think you should try to follow on and see exactly how that money is spent. One very simple thing to do is to just share the data with them. So look, I'm giving you, say, 700, 800 million as the United Nations to implement humanitarian work in Syria. I want you to give me a database by the end of each financial year that outlines exactly how each dollar has been spent. Currently, they don't know how that money is spent. They really don't.
Thanks, Karam. Anyone else? Sarah?
Yeah, to the first question, I'm not going to speak about this bigger picture because I agree it's a very, very difficult question. I want to speak about it sort of in a sort of the humanitarian operations sense and sort of how Western capitals can deal with this. And this is one thing that we've said, and I think other, like Human Rights Watch has said and others I think have said, is you need to take the subjective out of it, right? You have to systemize these kinds of verification, transparency processes in a way that's not dependent on who the German diplomat is for these 6 months, or who the UN resident coordinator is, and if he or she happens to agree or disagree with you. It needs to be on a sort of, you set a policy, you set a review process, and then that review process is followed as detailed as it can be for, I mean, for any issue really, but for us, from our perspective, sort of for the humanitarian operations. I think the other thing, and I think this has been emphasized by everyone on this panel, is transparency. Transparency. That should be the first demand of every actor operating in the Syrian context, be they a diplomat or a humanitarian worker on the ground. You need transparency to be able to look at what's happening in Syria, difficult as it is.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Please.
Just one point on the verification part of it. Yeah, absolutely need more transparency, but I think you were also talking about consistent pressure and continued verification, which is problematic when you have emerging crises and you have USAID people actually being flown to Ukraine right now, right? So those vetting procedures are being whittled away, the ones that even existed. So we need more resources, and the more resources bit comes from higher up. So we need people higher up to be committing those resources. And I think it goes beyond transparency, because I'm going to go back to the humanitarian stuff and actually say, what are the outcomes of this corruption on the people on the ground? Not just, okay, we need to get rid of corruption because we're just going to be, I mean, it's going to be whack-a-mole for the next 10 years. And that's fine. We need to engage in that game. But I think also reviewing what the outcomes are for people is really important. And, you know, the benefit of the past 10 years is that Western governments have dumped millions of dollars into Syria to support civil society, to build their capacity, NGOs, et cetera. Let's use that and continue to use that to sort of monitor what's going on, support scholars that are outside that understand the lay of the land, and what's actually happening on the ground. It's not an impossible feat by any means.
Thanks, Natasha. Ian?
Well, the thing is, my colleagues have said almost everything to be said, but I remember an example that came in one of the discussions on how some agencies, and since the WHO is one under the light now, I can give an example on that. The way they run their aid with, or their supplies with the government ministries, they supply them with medicines, with surgical tools, etc. And the Ministry of Health distributes that to the hospitals that are under its supervision within the regime controlled areas. Now, the problem there is that there is no monitoring of what happens afterwards. So in few instances, and that's my own experience, is that those surgical supplies, that kidney medicine, whatever it is, ended up being on the black market or in the Syrian army's hospitals, or whatever dynamic there is. And that makes you wonder, why did that happen? Where is the monitoring behind all of that? What is the value, or how is that affecting the communities that are supposed to be benefiting from this? Maybe that's something to be done. Work on the monitoring processes that are there.
Sorry, just really quick on that point, because there was a question about crossline. In my report on rescuing aid in Syria, I talk about this on the crossline element and the lack of monitoring from WHO in the Northeast specifically, since Yarubia was shut down. And it's quite bad in terms of just the disconnect between the needs and what's actually being distributed on the ground, because there is no monitoring with the actual implementers. And that's very problematic.
Great, we are almost out of time. So let me squeeze in one online question, which is very specific, I think, and it will be to Karam and Iyad. But the question basically says, what kind of services are the problematic, high risk and risky implementers providing? Is there like a specific sort of service that is mostly problematic, such as security, or is this more of an issue across the board in terms of whatever, transport, health, food?
Yeah.
Is there a specific sector that can be sort of pulled to a side and addressed, or is this more of a systematic, service-wide issue?
Yeah. Now, I'll refer to a couple of points. One of the indicators that we use in the Human Rights Watch and SLDP guide is the private security sector. I mean, you can imagine what happened to the militiamen and who runs these ones, and in a country where the regime is very much obsessed with military control over the country, to whose benefit these groups work. So that is a very problematic sector on its own. And in some conversations, we were told that we don't really have an option. We have to do that. And okay, if that's the situation, let's see how we can, come up with solutions to that, if that is the real problem there. But I'll go back to the example of Saqra Sahara, the Desert Falcon. The company is an import-export company. It's practically Fadi Saqr relying on the expertise of Bilal Naal, who's an import-export trader, to provide services and to provide supplies to the UNICEF and UNRWA, which are very benign things to buy. But the guys who are behind this are very problematic people. So it's not just the service itself, it's the individuals who are benefiting from this and redirecting those funds into furthering human rights abuses, and probably even worse, the war economy itself.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I'd say it's broad-based, and yeah, some sectors are more problematic, like private security, but there are some sectors that I think I'd love to work on, such as cash and voucher assistance. There was a very worrying report from the New Lines Institute where they interviewed some experts, and those experts said they believe that over 90% of that aid disappears. No one knows where it goes. So, and I'd love to do more work on this, and I'm trying to, but yeah, it's far more difficult to track cash handouts as opposed to physical aid.
To be continued.
Yeah.
On that note, we are out of time. So let me first thank our amazing panel, Iyad, Karam, Natasha, and Sarah. You've been excellent. I think we've tackled a lot of issues within this big problematic issue, and hopefully come out with some grounds for optimism in terms of there are ways to make this at least better, or less worse, or less bad than it is. So, and anything that we can do in that direction is a good thing. And thank you also to our in-person audience and everyone online for your participation. Very much look forward to convening all of you again sometime soon for another